I'm joined by the historian and political commentator Martyn Whittock. And Martyn, we're talking about the medieval era and the Black Death, the bubonic plague, because some new research by researchers at the University of Cambridge and also at the Leibniz Institute for the History and Culture of Eastern Europe have discovered that a volcanic eruption round about 1345 may have triggered the spread of the Black Death to many parts of Europe. And they're saying this because they've been studying tree rings and ice cores and found there was a considerable temperature drop which would have played havoc with crops, particularly around the Italian city-states. And they think that could have opened up bigger trading routes to places that already had the Black Death in places like the Baltic states. Firstly, as a historian yourself, what's your response to this research?
Well, I think it shows how new scientific research, alongside at times archaeological research as well, can give us a new take and more nuance, more of a drilling down into the processes of history, which we've been familiar with quite a long time in terms of the events, but often debates about causation and consequence go on, of course. And this kind of research means that we can get a new angle on it, perhaps a new appreciation of the kind of processes that are at work in things that we've actually been familiar with for quite a long time. Because we've known for centuries, of course, that the Black Death, caused by Yersinia pestis, bubonic plague, was absolutely devastating in the 1340s. Arrived in this country, for example, probably via Melcombe Regis, now a suburb of Weymouth, in the early summer of 1348, and was then raging across southern Britain by the end of 1348, and then spread to the whole of the British Isles. But of course, that was part of a continent-wide pandemic, which reached as far as Iceland and devastated communities, with a death rate overall of perhaps somewhere between a third and a half, in some areas worse, but certainly at least a third of the population probably died, and significantly more than that in this huge outbreak of 1347 to about 1350. And then it kept coming back in repeating cycles right through to the 17th century. And then the famous one that people will have heard about after this was the one that swept through London and other parts of the country as well, in the 1660s. So it really was the beginning of a series of recurring pandemics, but this was the very big one, and probably the first visitation of bubonic plague to Europe since we think the Justinianic plague, the plague of the Emperor Justinian in the 6th century. We think it had been here before. The key thing was, how did it get here? What was the mechanism? And it's this particular research that's giving us new insights into what was going on. We've known for a while, though, that it was basically the trade routes of Eurasia that brought it to Western Europe. So as early as 1346, chroniclers were talking about reports they'd heard of terrible events going on in China, terrible events going on in Asia, which clearly were the first reports of an appalling plague that was sweeping through Eastern Asia, which probably had started in the 1330s, we think, and was then spreading westward. Now, why this happened, we think, is because bubonic plague was endemic in rodent populations in Central Asia. And indeed, it still is endemic in the prairie dog population of the United States, for example. But it only impacts on human beings when there is a movement from animal to people, usually when an animal flea, because it has killed its host, then moves on to a human being and transfers it. So what's called an epizootic of animals then becomes an epidemic of people, and then it can mutate within the human body, and it can be then passed on from person to person via fleas, but also via coughing when it has its pneumonic form, and then it can appear in septicemic forms as well. So we've noticed this was happening for a long time, but what this new research suggests is that one of the factors may have been that the problems in crops between 1345 and 1347 caused an increased training grain with the Black Sea, with the Mongol Golden Horde. There seems to be a truce at this point in warfare that's going on there. And Italian city-states, for example, Venice and Genoa, imported grain in larger quantities because they were struggling with lack of food, because there had been this downturn in the weather system because of probably volcanic activity around 1345. And with the grain ships came rats, which also brought the plague to Europe. But I think it would have arrived here anyway, because, as I say, those reports from 1346, which talked about terrible things happening in China, suggest it was already beginning to move westward. But what these new researchers seem to have found out is something that may have accelerated its arrival in Europe, and from Italy then to the rest of Europe, because of this increased grain trade with the Crimea, for example, because of atmospheric problems, climatic problems that we think were caused by volcanic eruptions. So it reminds us of the incredibly complicated interplay between human and natural factors that cause things to happen in history, as were recorded by the chroniclers at the time, who of course didn't know what was happening.
Martyn, this all sounds very familiar, doesn't it? The idea that we hear rumours of awful illnesses far across the world, and then in very short order we see that developing on our own doorstep, and people have concerns over trade and the movement of people and goods and whether that's going to bring it to us. And we can think back to the pandemic of COVID-19, can't we? Now, that didn't have thankfully the death rates that the plague had, but does it show us that we are still just as interdependent as a world as we were back then?
Well, it reminds us, as you're quite rightly talking now, about the interconnectedness of societies. And although we live in a much more rapidly interconnected world through, for example, air flight, which can get somebody, from China to the UK or to the USA, in a matter of hours. And in the past, it would have taken weeks and months. But nevertheless, the connectivity has been here for centuries and centuries and centuries. So the so-called Silk Roads, for example, were centuries old in the 14th century, which connected up the whole of Eurasia. So there was movement then, as now, right across the Eurasian continent. And of course, also from other continents as well, though Eurasia was particularly connected up via the Silk Roads. And it does also remind us that pandemics, alarming as they are not new, because, of course, the flu pandemic at the end of the First World War killed more people globally than the First World War had done from 1914 to 1918. And yet, because of the trauma of the war, for many people, this just does not appear in what you might call the popular consciousness of the time. One would talk to older relatives. Very few of them spoke about the flu pandemic. They all spoke about the war, understandably, because the trauma of the war, to some extent, overshadowed a similar trauma, but more globally spread, that occurred afterwards. So we do live in an interconnected world. We do need to take that very, very seriously. And we also need to take very seriously the transmission of diseases from animals to people, because frequently the worst epidemics are caused when an epidemic, an epizootic amongst animals, mutates and then transfers to people, which is why when people are concerned about bird flu or swine flu or the poultry stocks of Southeast Asia, for example, or bats, for example, at Wuhan, and people say, well, what's that got to do with us? It's because when a pathogen, when something like this makes the species jump and then mutates, if it mutates, sometimes it doesn't, but if it does mutate, then in fact what has been killing animals can then hit effectively a virgin population of human beings who have no immunity against it, which is why the race to vaccine and which is why precautions are necessary. Although I know in our contested and turbulent world, there are people who are not persuaded by that. But the scientific evidence says something very, very different, that we do need vaccines and we do need to take very seriously the containment of these kind of outbreaks when they occur. When to do it and the timing of that, these are moot points. But that something necessary has to be done when these crises occur is absolutely beyond question. The problem is often we're combating the last crisis rather than thinking our way forward to the next one. People talk about people fighting the last war when they need to have the technology to fight the next one type thing. Well, this is the kind of thing that happens here. We need to learn from the past, because then when it comes again, there may be things similar, but there may be things different as well, which is why I've got my flu vaccine, for example. And this is why we encourage people to do this, because being fully vaccinated is an important part of this preparation.
Just finally then, Martyn, we've spoken about how interconnectedness goes back millennia, how pandemics and epidemics do as well. Our connectedness with God also goes back millennia. Can we take comfort, even in the middle of a war, even in the middle of a pandemic? Can we take comfort from how God has interacted with people in history?
I think the important thing to remember is, as John reminds us in that wonderful, moving prologue to his gospel, the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. The Logos, the one through whom God made all that is, became a human being, a real human being, and lives among us. And I think that reminds us of a number of things. It reminds us, first of all, of the love of God. Secondly, it reminds us of how seriously God takes people, that God really cares about real people. And the third thing it reminds us is that Jesus was not a plaster figure. He was not a distant figure. He became a real human being, a real baby in a real context. Political refugee, asylum seeker to Egypt. What more 21st century could one talk about? A tyrant seeking his death. This is what Jesus became at Christmas. This is what the Logos became at Christmas. And why did he do that? He did that because God wanted to show his love for humanity, to deal with what separated people from him, and to bring them back into relationship with himself. And this makes the story of Christmas so dramatic, so moving, but also so relatable and so relevant every year, every season, every time, because God enters into his creation to bring it back to himself. And I think that's what we need to be celebrating at Christmas. It's a wonderful reminder about how much you and I and every human being means to God, and how much he wants to enter into relationship with us to restore that relationship and bring it back to himself. What a reason for the season.
Martyn Whittock, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.